As human beings, we really all have the need for someone to listen to us. Unfortunately, listening is one of the forgotten skills of good communication. We often equate hearing with listening and think of it as a passive thing that we just do and it doesn't take any energy and effort. But the truth is, being a good listener is a skill. It can be learned and it also should be practiced. In this learning module, we're going to look at what it means to listen, ways of listening, common barriers to listening, and how to hone your listening skills. First of all, hearing and listening are not the same thing. Hearing is the sensory process that occurs in your brain when you receive and perceive sounds. Listening, on the other hand, is the active process of making meaning out of another person's spoken message. Listening is important because we spend the majority of our time listening. It's estimated that we spend up to 66% of our time each day on listening to others. For a long time, people thought that listening was just something everybody did and there weren't any really differences in how people listen. However, today we've learned that there are different listening styles and that people tend to have a primary style. It often creates miscommunication between people because of the way they might listen. The first style is people-oriented listeners. These types of listeners have concerns for others' feelings. They're interested in hearing personal information and find in areas of common interest. They're responsive to the emotional state of others. The second style is action-oriented listeners. They prefer information to be well-organized, concise, and error-free. They want to be able to do something with the information they hear. They're task-oriented, and they can be impatient and easily frustrated with disorganized presentations. The third type of listener are content-oriented listeners. They're responsive to complex and challenging information. They're systematic information processors, and they are going to carefully evaluate the facts and details before forming judgments and opinions. The final type of listener is time-oriented listener. They prefer brief or hurried interactions. They often mention how much time they have to listen or meet, and they're likely to interrupt others and openly signal disinterest in the conversation. Although we all have a preferred or primary listening style, we are able to adapt our style to fit other situations. When it comes to listening, the most popular model has been completed by Judy Brownwell, a researcher expert on listening. She has what is called the Hurrier model. In her model, she breaks hearing into a series of stages. The first stage, or in other words, the H in the model, is hearing. And that means the physical act of perceiving the sounds of whatever is being said. We definitely need to hear a person in order to be able to listen to them, but it is also possible to hear someone and not really be listening. So listening is more active than this initial process of hearing. The second step or stage in the model is the U, understanding. This means comprehending the words that we've heard. So figuring out what the person has said to us. Problems with understanding can occur when someone's speaking a language that we don't know, or they use a lot of jargon that we don't understand, or they use a lot of words that we don't understand. The third stage is R, that's remembering. That's the process of storing items into either our short-term or our long-term memory. Remembering things is a challenge. Research shows that most people remember about 25% of what they hear. And of that 25% they remember, they only remember 20% accurately. The fourth stage is the I, and we call that interpreting. And that's when we assign meaning to the words that we've heard from our sender. While there are similarities between understanding and interpreting, in interpreting we make decisions about people's intentions and whether they meant bad or good when they sent us the message. In the evaluating step, we're looking at whether our speaker's claims are true or not. Are they factual or are they just opinions? We're evaluating the source. The final step or stage is R, and that's us actually responding back to our sender. So we're letting them know that we're listening and we're providing a response in some way. There are 7 different types of listening responses that you might use. Some are more passive while others are more active. The most passive type of listening response is called stonewalling. And this is when you respond with silence and any lack of expression on your face. It basically signals a lack of interest. Being subject to consistent stonewalling is considered a type of emotional abuse. Ironically, this is a technique used in academic interviews in university settings to give no feedback and no eye contact, no signals whatsoever. A more active but still passive response is called back channeling, and that's when you use facial expressions, nods, and other nonverbal behavior and statements that such as I understand and that's interesting to let your speaker know you're paying attention. Back channeling is a good way of supporting your speaker, but it can be overused when this is always your response and you never have any other type of response. It can be viewed as just a way of stonewalling with some more active strategies. Paraphrasing is when you rephrase the speaker's words in your own words to let them know that you're listening and hopefully understand what they're saying. Paraphrasing is best used when you want to make sure that you clarify and on the same page. Paraphrasing can be very annoying if you do it all the time. Empathizing is when you convey to the speaker that you understand how they feel about a situation or topic that they're discussing. Supporting is when you express your agreement and show that you agree with the speaker's opinions or point of view. Analyzing is when you provide your own point of view on the topic of discussion and explain your own opinions and describe your own experience. And advising is when you respond by telling the speaker what you think they should or should not do, how they should think, feel, or act. The attached image shows how passive or active these different responding strategies are. So you can see that stonewalling is the most passive and advising is the most active. There is no one right or wrong way to respond, although stonewalling in a lot of places is a problem. But you really have to look at the situation and what's going on to determine the right response. So let me give you a situation from my own life. Sometimes at the end of the day, I like to just kind of share everything that's happened that day with my husband. I want him to empathize or just support me. My husband, on the other hand, is an action-oriented type of guy, and he's ready to advise me, analyze, and tell me what I should do. After many years of marriage, my husband and I have worked this situation out. But this is a good example of how you have to think about what type of response is the speaker really expecting from you. In addition to stages of listening, there's also different types of listening. We'll just cover a few here. The first type of listening is informational listening, and we do that when we go to class. We're listening just to gain information and what the speaker's saying. The next type of listening is critical listening, and that's when you analyze the message to determine what you think about it. Is it true, false, and do you agree or disagree with it? It doesn't mean that you have to disagree. It just means that you're actively thinking about your position and opinion relative to the information. The final type of listening we'll discuss here is empathic listening, and that's when we seek to listen to understand the other person's perspective and how they're feeling. It doesn't mean we feel sorry for them, but it means that we just try to understand how they feel and why they feel that way. When it comes to listening, our biggest issues are barriers. Most of the barriers are the results of noise that we talked about when we talked about the model of communication. In listening, it's not physical noise that's the biggest problem. It's psychological noise in our head. The first barrier to listening is pseudo-listening, and that's when we pretend to be listening even though our mind is elsewhere. We give cues that make it appear as if we're listening, but we're really not listening at all. Another barrier to effective listening is when we have so much different information that comes at us that we're just overwhelmed and cannot take in any more information. If you think about the amount of listening we do on a day-to-day basis, information overload is not hard to achieve. Another barrier to effective listening is the fact that our mind thinks much faster than people talk. We are capable of understanding up to 600 words per minute, while the average person speaks at fewer than 150 words per minute. When this gap between the words spoken per minute and what we can think about per minute occurs, we tend to drift away and think about and daydream about other things. We call this phenomenon glazing over. Another barrier to effective listening is the rebuttal tendency. This is when we're thinking of our reply to the speaker before the speaker has even finished what they're saying. So we don't know all of what they're saying because we're too busy using mental energy thinking of how we're going to respond to them. Another barrier to listening is closed-mindedness. This is when, if we don't agree with a particular position, we won't really listen to anything the speaker is saying. We just shut them out before they even have a chance for us to hear them. Another type of barrier to effective communication is competitive interrupting. And this is when the listener interrupts the speaker in order to get their ideas to be first or to be most heard. So they try to have their ideas and perspectives take priority. So now let's discuss how to be a better listener. Being a better listener starts with actually valuing listening, seeing it as important that you be and become a better listener. This starts by preparing to be a good listener. That means you need to get rid of distractions. The biggest one we all have is our cell phone. Listen with an open mind to what a speaker has to say, even if you disagree. Let the speaker finish talking before you respond. Listen first just to understand, then think about responding. Look for verbal and nonverbal cues as to how important the message is to the speaker. Listen for strong emotional content as well as the way that the meanings of the words are used. Be aware of cultural or age differences and gender differences in how people speak to each other and how they listen to each other. Make sure that they're looking for the same indicators in listening or speaking that you are. Respond in a way that shows you have listened and follow up with questions to show that you've listened. Make sure your nonverbal language shows that you're listening as well as your verbal response. If you need to disagree with the speaker, do so in a non-hostile way. Use a phrasing or terminology like, I have a different perspective, or I think about this a little bit different. Notice I didn't say you are wrong or I disagree with you in any way. From this lecture, I hope you've garnered that listening is important and that listening is kind of a silent form of communication. Listening is the best skill that you can have in any relationship whether it be personal or work. So it's definitely a skill you should work to hone. Good listeners get ahead because they hear information and know things that other people haven't picked up on. And they're good at responding to others appropriately. So as we end this lecture, I encourage you to take stock and think about what kind of listener you are and how you can be better. So that's Professor Bernhardt's soapbox for today, and thank you for coming to my TED Talk.